Soccer is not an endurance sport. This is something I've said, and I always end up in this position afterwards because for some reason, soccer fans, coaches, and players, they seem to take the most pride in the idea that soccer players are endurance athletes and they have far greater endurance than any other sport there is, at least with mainstream sports compared to basketball, football, baseball, rugby, etc., etc. But here's the problem. Are soccer players actually endurance athletes like these guys up here? The answer is no. They're simply not. And here's why. So while it is true that soccer players do cover more total distance than athletes in other sports like football, basketball, baseball, or rugby, is it really on par with cross-country, marathon runners, and other athletes like that? Well, according to this, on average, a soccer player only runs about 6.4 miles a game. 6.4 miles in a 90-minute game is not very impressive. In fact, if you were to run at 6 miles per hour for 90 minutes straight, you would run 9 miles, absolutely obliterating this 6.4 miles per game for professional level soccer players at the 2016 European Championship. But let's take a closer look at that study on players in the European Championship, because the total distance covered was not actually all running distance. It was literally every distance of movement they covered during the entire game. So this actually included walking, slow jogging, running, high speed runs, and of course, sprints. And this is how they covered it. Walking was 0 to 7 kilometers per hour. Jogging was 7.1 to 14.5 kilometers per hour. Running is 14.6 to 20 kilometers per hour. High speed running was 20.1 to 25 kilometers per hour. And sprinting is anything greater than 25 kilometers per hour. So let's look at the breakdown of the athletes. So for starters, let's look at the total distances covered. The total distances covered range from just under 9.5 kilometers to just over 11 kilometers. Central defenders covering the least ground and central midfielders covering the most ground. Now, look at this. Every single player covered at least 3 kilometers of walking. The average for central defenders is 3.6 walked kilometers and gets all the way up to 3.7 walked kilometers. Attackers and wide midfielders are also walking 3.5 kilometers. That's a lot of walking. Now, central midfielders are a little bit lower here because they have a little bit more distances to cover, so they probably have to cover it at a bit higher speeds than just walking. Jogging distances. Central defenders are jogging by far the least at 3.8 kilometers. Wide defenders are up to 4.1. We have central midfielders that are jogging the most at 4.7 kilometers. Wide midfielders 4.1 and attackers at 4.2. Running distances here, I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm just going to let you look at them. But notice downward trends. And then we have the high speed running, even more downward in total distances covered. And lastly, we have sprinting distances. And the wide defenders actually seem to sprint the most of anyone, with the average being 195 meters, the high end being 220. The midfielders are in between, and we have the wide midfielders and attackers sprinting the next most, probably because wide midfielders and attackers are your players that are making the most intense attacking movements, going 1v1, trying to make runs in behind defenders. So they're running the highest speeds most often. I also have data from the 2015 Women's World Cup and the type of running that was done there. Look in this table right here. We'll notice something. The majority of the bouts of any type of movement whatsoever are from 0 to 6 kilometers per hour with 394 bouts, and 6 to 12 kilometers per hour with 498 bouts. Average distances being 8 meters to 9 meters, with recovery times of 7 to 8 seconds each time. Now, as the speeds get higher, for obvious reason, far less bouts overall, except for when we get to above 23 kilometers per hour, because sprinting is the most important physical trait in soccer. But the distances seem to decrease, and we also seem to find higher recovery times after each of these. So my next point is that soccer, not being an endurance sport, uses different energy systems from what endurance sports do. We have three different energy systems: the phosphocreatine system, the glycolytic system, and the oxidative system. And it's listed here with a variety of different sports and the percentages that are used in those sports. And yes, you technically use all three energy systems in all sports to some degree. But when we look at this, let's look at some of the distance ones. So rowing, running, and swimming distance. Look at this. The phosphagen system for running is only 10. Rowing, it's 20. But when we get over to the oxidative energy systems, 50 and 70, the majority of their sport is spent in the oxidative system. That swimming distance, once again, 10 in the phosphagen system, only 20 in the glycolytic, and 70 in the oxidative system. Soccer, right above it, has 50 in the phosphagen system, 20 in the glycolytic oxidative, and 30 in the oxidative energy system. And why is this? It's because soccer is an alactic aerobic sport. It is intermittent high intensity running followed by lower intensity moments for recovery. Yes, soccer is a game with no true stoppages. For 45 minutes, take a break, then 45 minutes again. However, the actual physical actions of the players are intermittent and you are recovering during these times. That's probably why the majority of actions players do with their covered distance is walking and slow jogging. So lastly, one of the most important things for sports performance is the fact that endurance athletes and speed and power athletes, like this track athlete here, use different types of muscle fibers primarily. They use fast twitch muscle fibers that will grow larger muscles, to where endurance athletes tend to mostly use their slow twitch muscle fibers, which don't put on much muscle mass. Now, I have to ask you a question before I show you the answer. Which one of these is closer to the physique of most professional soccer players? This guy or this guy? Here we have four different professional soccer players: Robert Lewandowski, Cristiano Ronaldo, Jack Grealish, and Adama Traore. I want you to notice something that all of them have. They're quite muscular, quite athletic, strong, and this makes them fast and powerful on the pitch. So, no, they don't look like endurance athletes. They look like speed and power athletes, trained to sprint and be fast and powerful. Now, what does this mean for training our athletes? Does this mean there is no endurance component for soccer? Of course not. There is an endurance component, but it's mostly speed and power endurance. Your ability to repeat high intensity actions such as sprinting, change in direction, jumping, or shooting, or going into tackles. And how we train for this should be dictated by those actions. So, should you go on a long 5-mile run to get fit for soccer? No. Should you be jogging for 90 minutes straight because you have to be able to go 90 minutes for a game? No, you shouldn't. The majority of your fitness should actually come from playing the game, because that's the most specific way to train for soccer. But what I want to point out is you should prioritize speed and power even before conditioning and endurance. And the reason for this is, if you have a higher ceiling for speed, your max speed is higher, then you will be able to run submaximal speeds while using less energy. Not to mention, as you fatigue, how it matters in soccer is how it makes you slower. Faster players will slow down and still be at higher speeds than slower players. But the conditioning you do after that needs to be reflected by the actual demands of the game, not the demands of endurance long distance running, because soccer is not an endurance sport. It's a speed and power endurance sport.